Well, here's the second PowerPoint presentation for the lecture part of the class. I'm going to break these down into smaller videos because it takes a long time to upload them onto this YouTube channel. Let's move onwards and forwards. Here we go. Last time we did talk about the Hadean, 4.6 to 4 billion years ago, and so I'm not going to go into that. Here's where we left off. We're starting off talking about the Archean Eon next, and that's from 4 billion years ago to 2.5 billion years ago. You might recall that during the Hadean, the previous Eon, the Earth was covered by lava. It was an extremely inhospitable place, a place where you had these tiny little islands that had formed in the middle of these lava oceans. We had no atmosphere to speak of. There wasn't enough time to make an atmosphere. Well, by Archean time, we started to form our first small continents. And this occurred as those little islands that we saw before in the previous image, these little islands, collided together one after another, forming larger islands, which formed larger islands, until finally we formed small amounts of continental crust. So one thing you want to sort of keep in the back of your mind is that during the Archean, the continents had finally started to form. This particular map of the world can be found in your textbook. And it shows you where Precambrian rock can be found. There's 3 colors on this map: red, green, and light brown. The red areas are what we call shields. The green areas geologists call platforms. The light brown areas, they didn't mention it here, but those are called orogenic belts. And I'll spell that for you. Orogenic belts. Shields, like this one here in North America called the Canadian Shield, are places where Precambrian rocks are exposed at the surface of the Earth. Another way of saying it is, in all those places on that map where you have red, you have rocks that are older than 542 million years old. That's what Precambrian means, exposed at the surface of the Earth. The green areas are called platforms. And those are places where you have Precambrian rocks, once again, rocks older than 542 million years old, but they are underground. They are covered by younger rocks. The orogenic belts, the light brown areas, are places where there are no Precambrian rocks. So another way of saying it is these places in light brown did not exist during the Precambrian, did not exist before 542 million years ago. These red areas and these green areas taken together we call platforms. Platforms are places where you can find Precambrian rock, either underground or below ground. And I'm sorry. The green areas are platforms, the red areas are shields, and the red and green areas taken together are called cratons. 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 So the red and green areas taken together are called cratons. And so these cratons are the ancient hearts of the continents. The ancient heart of North America, it centers around this little body of water right here. you might not be aware of it, then maybe you are. It's called the Hudson Bay area. It's north of Ottawa and north of Quebec City, which in French is called Le Vieux de Quebec. Bottom line is, this is the ancient heart of North America around the Hudson Bay area. Let's go to the next PowerPoint. Here's some interesting rocks. These are Archean rocks. And these are called granite gneiss complexes. Granite gneiss, G-N-E-I-S-S complexes. Over here, you've got some more of this granite. But these granite gneiss complexes represent those little continents that we talked about a few minutes ago that started to form during the Archean. So this is the first continental crust, and it's represented by these granite gneiss complexes. So you might want to make a note, make a mark in your notes. As far as Archean rocks go, one of the things you want to remember is that's when the granite gneiss complexes formed during the Archean Eon. And the second type of Archean geological formations we're going to talk about are the Greenstone Belts. The Greenstone Belts. And just as the name implies, these rocks are green in color. Let me show you what they look like. I'm going to go here to my web browser to show you what they look like. They're made of a rock called komatiite. K-O-M-A-T-I-I-T-E. And as you can see from this picture, komatiite is greenish in color. You might recall that green igneous rocks like komatiite are ultramafic or ultra dark. And they can the interesting thing is these rocks can only form under very high temperatures, such as 1200 to 1300 degrees Celsius. And what these greenstone belts tell us is that during the Archean, the Earth was very, very hot, covered by these ultramafic lavas that were erupting onto the surface of the Earth. Komatiites can't form anymore because there's not enough heat left within the Earth. But back during the Archean, it was a very hot world covered by these extremely hot lavas. Third type of geological formations that you need to remember about the Archean are the pillow basalts. P-I-L-L-O basalts. This shows you pillow basalts. Remember when we talked about James Hutton and the principle of uniformitarianism? Well, pillow basalts. Let's take a look and see where these things form. Here you can see they form on the bottom of the ocean. So these rocks formed in the bottom of the ancient Archean oceans. So we had oceanic crust, represented by these pillow basalts, and we have these granite gneiss complexes, representing continental crust. So by Archean time, we're starting to get plate tectonics like more similar to what it is today. Here you can see various cratons. Once again, cratons are where you have these shields and platforms combined. Anyway, here is one craton. It's called the Slave Craton up in the Northwest Territories in Canada. And you got the Superior Craton here that goes through much of Canada, going to Manitoba, to Ontario, to Quebec, and even up into the Michigan area, northern Michigan. These dark green areas are greenstone belts. And these other areas in between the greenstone belts are your granite gneiss complexes. So we did have plate tectonics during the Archean. We had continental crust forming. The plates moved faster because there was more heat in the Earth, so there was more convection in the mantle during the Archean. Here you can see various greenstone belts, and they collided together to make one big craton here in Canada. Another thing that happened that's real important during the Archean is that's when we formed our atmosphere. Now, where does our atmosphere come from? Well, it comes mostly from volcanic outgassing. When volcanoes erupt, they release all kinds of different gases: carbon dioxide, water, hydrogen, nitrogen. Our atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. The nitrogen came from volcanic outgassing. CO2, water came out, and that's what forms clouds, and it would end up making oceans. So we started to have oceans during the Archean. Recall that during the Hadean, we didn't have oceans. It was too hot and the water evaporated. But by Archean time, the Earth had cooled down enough so we had honest-to-goodness oceans and continents. The only gas in our atmosphere that does not come from volcanic outgassing is oxygen. Oxygen comes from photosynthesis. I wrote the chemical reaction for photosynthesis for you in the previous classes, and you can look that up. But it's basically what plants do and what plankton do in the oceans. They take in carbon dioxide and water, and they make glucose and oxygen. And so our atmosphere mostly comes from volcanic outgassing, except for oxygen, which comes from photosynthesis. The photosynthesis that occurred during the Precambrian came from tiny little creatures that live in the ocean, phytoplankton, not from plants. Later on, plants would contribute more oxygen to the atmosphere. So we do know we have an ocean then. Now let's start talking about life. Remember last time we talked about the Linnaean classification scheme for life? We went from domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, to species. Well, you might also recall that we talked about there being one of the main domains is domain eukarya. And domain eukarya is different from domain eubacteria and domain archaea because domain eukarya are what we call eukaryotes. These are sexual creatures. They reproduce by sexual reproduction, and they include animals, plants, protists. Protists are single-celled eukaryotes, and funguses. These other ones, bacteria and archaea, they are what we call prokaryotes. They are asexual creatures. They reproduce by cloning, so they don't have diversity. You might recall that as well. What's the oldest evidence of life on our planet? Well, it comes from 3.5 billion years ago, which can also be written like this, capital G, small a. But some people think that life might have existed on the planet as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. So, we've got domain eukarya, which includes kingdom Animalia. In English, it's animals. Kingdom Plantae, Plantae. Kingdom Protista, in Latin, and English, protists. Kingdom Fungi, Animalia, Plantae, Protistae, and Fungi, with two I's in Latin. Those are the four kingdoms of domain eukarya. So what is life? Life involves creatures that metabolize. In other words, they maintain their cell structure. They either make their own food, in which case they are called producers, or they eat food, in which case they're called consumers. So they metabolize. Their cells function. If they're an advanced organism, their organs function. They either make food or they consume food. That's what metabolism is about. And they reproduce. They produce a new generation. That's what life is. And it appears to have appeared on the planet about 3.8 billion years ago, but definitely by 3.5 billion years ago. So on the test, don't forget, life appeared during the Archean Eon. Now, how did life begin on planet Earth? I'm not going to pretend like I can tell you the answer to that question. And if anybody tells you that they can, it's pure speculation because of some of this material that I'm about to cover. But what I will do tonight is tell you about two of the main scientific theories regarding the origin of life on planet Earth. The first one comes from a man named Stanley Miller. Now, who is Stanley Miller? Let's take a look. There's Stanley Miller right there. He passed away in the 90s. Back in the 1950s, at the University of California, San Diego, he decided to do an experiment to figure out how did life begin on planet Earth. That's quite a thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. Here's his scientific apparatus. Now let's take a look at the apparatus from your drawing from your book. What he did was he put gases into this large glass vessel. And these gases represented to him what he thought the early atmosphere must have been like. He put in all these different gases in the proper proportions. He had electrodes, and so that he could add electricity to these gases. There was water in there as well. Inside, so the gases are in the water, and then you could add an electrical charge. And what this was supposed to do was represent how life began. Once you add the electrical charge represents a lightning strike in those ancient Archean oceans. And he wanted to see what came out down these tubes and could he make life in the laboratory? Did Stanley Miller make life in the laboratory? The answer is no. But he did make something. Let's take a look and see what he made. So, going back to this, I'm going to show you what he made. Stanley Miller made amino acids. What are amino acids? Well, these things are amino acids. Amino acids, the water in this vessel here became dark orange and was filled with amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of life. Did Stanley Miller make life in the lab? No. Did he make amino acids? Yes. So his idea was, in those ancient Archean oceans, a lightning strike occurred, and converted those gases dissolved into the water into the building blocks of life, amino acids. Well, I can deal with that. That makes sense. But the rest of his theory is quite a reach, in my opinion, because as I mentioned before, he did not make life. In order to make life, you have to make proteins. Now, what are proteins? Proteins are chains of amino acids, thousands and thousands of them linked together. So, Stanley Miller's idea was that after this lightning strike produced those amino acids must have somehow linked together to make a protein. I'm skeptical that this happened, and I'll tell you why. Because in order for amino acids to link together to make proteins, it violates a law of science called the second law of thermodynamics, which states that systems move towards disorder, not to order. And if that happened, it has never happened again. Second reason I'm skeptical that this is the way life began is that if that's so, then why can't we produce life in the laboratory? If that was possible, it would have been done by now. Thousands of people have tried. No one's gotten close to making a protein. Now, Stanley Miller was a very persistent fellow, and he kept on running his experiments all the way into the 90s. It worked all the way into his 80s. And he did manage to make these things here, which are, he got some of these amino acids to link up to make proteinoids. And these things here are proteinoids. Proteinoids, spelled Proteinoids. Proteinoids can replicate. They can reproduce. But remember, life must be able to metabolize as well. These are not living things. They do not have cell structure. They do not consume food or make food. So they're not living things. He tried to get these proteinoids to run other experiments to make proteinoids. He was not successful. So that is basically the first idea, scientific idea, that a lot of people think is a good explanation for how life began. In the ancient Archean oceans, a lightning strike produced proteins. The proteins combined together to make proteinoids. Proteinoids somehow combined together to make proteins. But no one has been able to do the third step, to go to the proteinoids to the proteins. And I think it's because it's impossible. But that is one of the main scientific theories regarding the origin of life. There's a second theory. Remember, we talked about there being 3 domains of life. Domain Eubacteria. In English, that's bacteria. Domain Archaea. And what is domain Archaea? And then domain Eukarya, which we just talked about, animals, plants, funguses, and protists. But what is Archaea? Let's take a look here. Domain Archaea. Well, in order to tell you about domain Archaea, I got to tell you a story. Back in the 1970s, French submariners discovered a new form of life at these things on the bottom of the ocean. We find these things called black smokers. And so on the bottom of the ocean, you've got these chimney-like structures that are spewing out almost what looks like chimney smoke, but remember, this is underneath the ocean. And when you look carefully at this black smoke, it's filled with these tiny little creatures, which are domain Archaea. This is a new form of life. Let's take a look again what they look like. They're single cell, they're very primitive. But the thing about these things that's kind of interesting is They are what we call extremophiles. EXT, extreme philes, PHILES. PHILES. These are creatures that can live in boiling hot water. They can live in the ice underneath thousands of feet underneath the Antarctic. They are creatures that live under extreme conditions, and they're called domain archaea. But the other thing that's interesting about domain archaea is they're producers, but they don't make their own food like plants and those um, phytoplankton through photosynthesis. Instead, they make their own food by converting the chemicals in that hot water, in those black smokers, to food. Chemically speaking, if you're interested, they convert sulfates into sulfides. And so they make their own food, which is the sulfides, and the food comes out of that hot water. Well, so the second big idea regarding how life began in the Archean is maybe life began from these creatures, domain archaea. And people who believe in this make the argument that, well, during the Archean, the Earth was very, very hot. We had boiling water, just like around those black smokers we see today. And so, who could have survived in those ancient oceans but domain archaea? They could have withstood those extreme conditions that existed during the Archean Eon. And the second thing they use to support their argument is that when we look at domain archaea more carefully, these creatures, we find they are extremely diverse. They might not look too diverse to you. They might look all the same to you here, but if you look at them carefully, they're very diverse. For example, if you go to those hot water pools in Yellowstone, they're filled with these creatures. And there's more genetic diversity within one pool of hot water 50 feet wide than there is amongst all of the animals in Africa. And one thing we know is that genetic diversity takes time. So if these creatures are so diverse, they should be the oldest creatures on planet Earth. So the second idea as to how life began is they began through domain archaea. But there's a flaw in that argument. The flaw in that argument is we don't find any fossil evidence of domain archaea in Archean rocks. So until we find that in the rocks, I don't think we can say that this makes sense. But I wanted to tell you about the two main ideas on how life began: the Stanley Miller approach and domain archaea approach. Here you can see those black smokers. They're on the bottom of the ocean where we have lots of domain archaea. And interestingly enough, these things are giant worms, 7 to 9 feet long, and they feed on those domain archaea. Their food source is domain archaea. So lots of larger creatures also feed in these extreme environments. What is the earliest evidence of life? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's stromatolites. The oldest fossil evidence we have in the rocks are the stromatolites. Now, what are stromatolites? Here you can see a photograph from your book. There's a man standing there for scale. And these are made of cyanobacteria, not domain archaea, cyanobacteria. These are belong to domain eubacteria, and these are photosynthesizing creatures. Single-celled photosynthesizing creatures. Remember what that means, ladies and gentlemen. Think about it. Photosynthesis makes oxygen. So this is where the oxygen on planet Earth must have come from these stromatolites. They added the oxygen in Earth's early atmosphere. And they are the earliest form of life that we can find in the rock record, going back to 3.5 billion years ago. Stromatolites still live today. That's why you see this man standing near all these stromatolites. But they go back to 3.5 billion years ago. We find them in Tennessee, in rocks hundreds of millions of years ago, close to Knoxville, at crystal in a cave system near Knoxville. Anyway, here you can see stromatolites preserved in rocks. Very common in the Archean. So in the Archean, what do we have? Well, we have granite gneiss complexes. What else do we have? We have pillow basalts. We have greenstone belts and stromatolites. Here's some tiny little Archean microfossils. And so we have life going back to 3.5 billion years ago. The Archean rocks contain many valuable ore deposits. Here's a list of them: gold, platinum, zinc, copper, nickel, chrome, and gemstones. That's really what geology is about. For many people, it's the mining industry. And we extract many valuable ores from Archean rocks. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is my YouTube video for Chapter 8. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of Chapter 9 here. Now we're Chapter 9 in your book is about the Proterozoic Eon. The Proterozoic Eon began 2.5 billion years ago and continues on till 542 million years ago. Proterozoic fossils are not common. Archean fossils are not common. You have to really search far and wide to find them. Life does not really start. Fossils do not really start to become abundant until about 542 million years ago. But we will talk about some very important fossils during the Proterozoic that formed. And these are the first organisms that are sexual creatures. They belong to domain Eukarya. And that poses a very interesting question. If only asexual creatures existed during the Archean, and then all of a sudden, during the Proterozoic, about 1.5 million years ago, sexual creatures appear, how did the first sexual organisms come into being? They must have come into being from asexual organisms. And how did that happen? So we'll take a look at theories on how that occurred. Another thing about the Proterozoic you want to remember is that we don't find greenstone belts and granite gneiss complexes like we did back during the Archean. The Earth is starting to cool down. We also start to get passive continental margins. What does that mean? Well, as we move onwards and forwards, I'll talk about that. We'll also find lots of these banded iron formations in the Proterozoic. We'll talk about that as well. Those are found in the Proterozoic, banded iron formations. They're also called BIFs, B-I-Fs. So here we go to the Proterozoic. 2.5 billion years ago to 542 million years ago. I'm going to stop here, and when you're ready, go on to the third video.